You've heard of heroic labs by now, and we keep talking about them because in today's mature market, you need every edge to be successful. Rather than spending those precious company dollars on building game tech, focus on building your game and shipping it. Get into your players' hands faster and grow your community. Heroic Labs is battle-tested partner and friend of the podcast. Their tech enables you to be flexible, creative, and scale for success. Heroic Labs has your tech stack covered. Whether you're looking for a world-class back-end game server, an amazing game development framework, fantastic live ops tooling, or reliable mass scalability, Heroic Labs has solutions for all of these challenges. And it's not just us at Deconstructor of Fun praising Heroic Labs. The company works with some of the world's biggest publishers on many of the beloved games. Focus on your game, save a big chunk of cheese, and avoid tech risks with Heroic Labs. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So, Sebastian, can you talk about who are you and what do you do?
So I started out my career in advertising, decided I didn't want to sell beer and cars anymore. Asked myself, what do I really want to do? Well, I've been playing Paradox games since I was 10. I've understood the Paradox games since I was probably 16, but I've been playing them for a very long time. I want to take a shot. Got into Paradox after a long process. Started out as a product marketing manager. I think the first games that I worked on were Pillars of Eternity Console Edition. Surviving Mars was my first big kind of sim ship release for all platforms. Went on to become part of something at Paradox called the New Games team. This was a few years ago when we were re-evaluating how we do everything from third party to green light process and all of these things. Shams Georgiani, the current CEO of Arrowhead, he was my boss. He was the one who recruited me into that team. Part of that challenge was, how do we balance kind of big third-party projects out a little bit? Can we do small games? And that's kind of how Paradox Arc was born. So now I'm running Paradox Arc. It's a sub-label of Paradox Interactive, a sub-label that is primarily focused on finding up-and-coming developers. So smaller teams, they've released, maybe no games, maybe one game. We even have solo developers making games for us. And we sign those games in order to find the kind of next big thing for Paradox over time.
The finding of the next big thing.
Yeah.
For those who are not familiar with Paradox, so Paradox is Stockholm-based, publicly listed game publisher. Can you talk a little bit more about what is Paradox before we start talking about Paradox Arc and why the world needs it?
Paradox Interactive is a games publisher that, like you said yourself, based in Stockholm, Sweden. One of the, I would say, major players in Sweden. Also, one of the major players in terms of strategy, management, and simulation games, I would say, in general, especially on Steam. We're famous for creating the grand strategy genre. Our CEO, Fred, he likes to say that Civilization call themselves a grand strategy now. And that's what we call a cultural victory. That's not what it used to be. We started out small, started out as a studio, Paradox Development, and basically did grand strategy games. So Crusader Kings, Europa Universalis, of course, Stellaris, Hearts of Iron, Imperator, Victoria. It's north of 25 games, probably. Most of them in that genre. So that's kind of where we started out. And then at a later point, we wanted to self-publish. So we started up a publishing arm, and then we started to publish other people's games. And that part of Paradox, which is, of course, Paradox Interactive both publish our own games. And that's not just Paradox Development Studio. We also have other studios like Triumph in Holland, who makes Age of Wonders 4, as well as Iceflake in Finland. We also have Playrion, but we also have a third-party kind of publishing arm. Third-party publishing arm have historically we released a number of titles that turned out to be big. The first Mountain Blade, Magica, City Skylines, of course, which is our most successful third-party game. So that's kind of what Paradox Interactive is. Basically a publisher of endlessly replayable games, primarily in strategy and management.
Got it. And with a market cap of about $1.5 billion, even in the downturn.
Probably. Yeah.
It's just good to give a context, even in the sort of a downturn of the gaming industry, just to give the idea of the size. And how many people work at Paradox?
About 600 people.
Okay, so it is a sizable, not a gigantic publisher, but it is a sizable over $1 billion publisher, focused especially on PC and through PC, the Steam content. So that's very interesting. And so you talked about all the games that you're developing internally. You talked about third-party development. Why is there a need for Paradox Arc? Why can't the third-party development teams handle what you're essentially doing?
We're not a massive company, but certainly bigger than we used to be. And a couple of years back, we were kind of realizing that we had stopped signing the kind of games that made us successful in the first place, in a way. So Paradox Interactive grew a lot. And when you grow a lot, you realize that the more you grow, the more things become an opportunity cost, right? Because if you have expectations on returns and growth, right, taking a chance on a really small game at the cost of doing something much bigger becomes an actual cost, right? Even though that sounds kind of counterintuitive, you always have to decide what do you do, what don't you do, right? No step back DLC for Hearts of Iron 4, or are you going to do a super high risk small game with a untried studio, right? Or are you going to do like a big third party game that has massive breakout potential, right? We kind of sat down and we realized that if somebody pitched us City Skylines today, would we have signed it, right? People forget that City Skylines was a really small project as compared to, most third-party projects that we work with now. And the answer is I don't know. And that's crazy, right? As I said, because City Skylines is absolutely our biggest franchise. So obviously we're not doing something anymore that we should probably do. At the same time, since we released City Skylines in 2015, the expectation of what a Paradox Interactive game has changed, right? I'm not sure if we released, a game like that or, CK2 or one of those games, if we released them today, if they would have had the same reception, right? Expectations have changed on internally, kind of what kind of games we need to make, but also externally, what is a Paradox Interactive game? We figured that we need to have a different organization, a different team, basically, that doesn't have all of the overhead that a big publisher has. And we also need a different label that shows that this is a Paradox game, but it's not Crusader Kings 3. That's why Paradox needed a new label. So that's kind of the reason why Paradox Arc exists, to be able to sign games that have more humble beginnings, basically, but that we think share DNA with us. There are a large number of games that are not necessarily grand strategy games or city builders, but that I think they could definitely have been Paradox Interactive games because they serve the same kind of need, right?
Got it. So it's a sub-brand for Paradox, and it's clearly a signature brand because you're using the Paradox still as a name. It's almost like a Pepsi Max or a Coca-Cola Diet or Coca-Cola Light. So there's opportunity cost. You're focused on franchises, on big breakout hits. And if you go for smaller, uncertain, indie games, that's not the logical choice. And then there's the expectation, both internal and external, of what is a Paradox game of today, not of before. But at the same time, like what has happened with a lot of companies is as they move up the sort of a value ladder of making bigger and better games, they tend to leave the games behind that made them successful originally. And that, of course, opens up new space for new companies to come in and start from where that company started. And in case if that company is unable to successfully move the value ladder, their new games are not, returning as they were supposed to. They kind of end up in the no man's ground. They're not, making the big games. They're not making the small games, and they're just making mediocre games. And that's the most dangerous position in the crowded market of today. So the way I understood it is like you're still keeping that origin of Paradox through this new label, If you're the airline company, this is the budget airline with a much cheaper costs to run, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to compete in the market.
So I would say that the main differences between Paradox Arc and Paradox Interactive is where is the focus, right? People kind of forget that Paradox Interactive titles, they start to peak at like year 3, like DLC 3, year 3. They're very seldom massively successful on launch. And we're kind of doing that, but on a smaller scale with smaller games. So we are kind of doing the same thing that Paradox Interactive has always kind of done. It's just that Paradox Interactive is kind of a different scale. Paradox Arc is sort of the origin story of Paradox Interactive, but like in the future, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's the new wave. It's also interesting because you don't have the same type of expectations for these games, so you can be much more liberal in the type of studios you work with and type of games that you make. And so the question is like, how do you identify potential games and developers given this lack of restrictions that any established franchise would have?
So Paradox Arc also exists, I want to say, so that we can explore kind of adjacent genres and stuff that Paradox Interactive might not have been able to explore, just because, again, the expectations of what a Paradox Interactive game is. But generally, I don't like to talk about genre. We talk a lot about game pillars. We have 5 game pillars, and the abbreviation is very easy to remember. It's Alice in the Wonderland, going deep into the rabbit hole, right, to deep games. So Alice basically is 5 game pillars. A stands for agency. Paradox Interactive has a tagline called "We create the games, you create the stories." Our games are not generally games where we tell the story. They're games that are there for the players to tell their own story. So emergent narrative. Our games are not about us and what we want to bring to the world. It's about you, right? Hearts of Iron 4 is so interesting because everyone wonders what would have happened if Germany didn't invade Soviet Union, right? You create your own kind of alternative history with our games. And that can kind of translate to a million different genres, I think. And then we have L, which is living world. It can't be kind of a limited arcade experience where there needs to be some sort of dynamic simulation going on around you. It can't feel like you're alone. It needs to feel like you're almost not playing a game. It's like the game's playing you in a way. I is inviting, basically a different word for compelling. So we like to say that either the game is really accessible or they're so compelling that you're willing to put down the time to learn them, right? We like to say that history is a really, really great IP because everyone has feelings about it, right? It's relevant to almost everyone on the planet, right? I think Arrowhead, the creators of Helldivers, they have a really good saying, which is a game for everyone is a game for no one. It's just a different way of saying, let's try to make compelling games. So that's inviting. And then we have C, cerebral. So, we don't insult our players' intelligence. We think that our games are not about reactions and being fast. Our games are about thinking deeply, thinking ahead, challenging the mind. If we made a shooter, it wouldn't be Counter-Strike, it would be Arma. It would rather be the military simulation, not the arcade team kind of thing. Last one, I think E, so endless experiences or endless replayability, you could even say, but endless basically. So Paradox, you don't stop playing Paradox games. And this, I would say, is probably the most important pillar and the pillar that we are least likely to disregard when we're looking at a game. And it's because it's so important not only to what a Paradox game is and that whole player experience, but also to the model that we have, right? We build games over decades. That's what we do. At Paradox Arc, we're not looking for CK3. We're looking for the next CK2, right? CK2 had 2,000 CCU, so concurrent users, on Steam its launch week. CK3 had 98,000. The delta here is 12 years or something like that worth of development and releases, right? Free content, paid content.
and just building and building and building and building and building and building. And you can only do that if you have a game with high retention, i.e. a game that people come back to all the time and are willing to spend both time and money to keep playing, to keep investing in DLCs and or whatever it is they want to spend their money on. So we can keep building and keep paying people to develop the games. To go back to the kind of original question, like how do we look at games? We look at them through the lens of Alice. It's our identity. It's what we do. It's the kind of game I like to play, and most people at Paradox like. So that's also like not completely unimportant, but also it goes hand in hand with our entire idea, the entire idea for Paradox as a business.
And how big of a team do you have analyzing whether a game that is being proposed to you, that are often very small games, actually fits these quite lofty pillars? And like, how well are these pillars defined? Because if you, like you just told me what Alice means,
yeah,
I could play a lawyer and get a lot of different games into this. And then again, there are a lot of different games that might not fit, but actually grow into these pillars.
Yeah, 100%. So the team is not super big. And the reason why is because we don't like generally creative committees. In essence, it's 5 people that look at it. And I mean, Alice is not a schematic, right? Like you can't go like ALICE. Oh, it's 9 out of 10 on that, and then 7 out of 10 on that. It's that, it is a question of judgment. We will have games that wouldn't score super well on one of these pillars, right? Mm-hmm. That's okay. We can be flexible within them. It's not a rule book, because honestly, you can't make games according to a rule book. I think everyone who's made one or worked with them knows that, right? But it is sort of a lens, if you will.
So gut feeling of 3 Swedes is what makes it.
Well, it's like, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, what is it?
Okay. Got it. No, that's there's different ways, and this is creative industry. So that's a way to put it. But you have these pillars that you kind of use as a reference point. When it comes to these different signals, when you look at a game that is in development early on, like how do you know that it can have this long-term potential where, after 3 DLCs, it really starts reaching its peaks and it actually has what it takes to be a franchise?
So first of all, obviously, it always starts with the game and the prototype or the proof of concept or whatever you want to call it. Depends on where in the process we are when we're going to sign the game, how difficult or hard it is. So it's going to look different from process to process, right? When you have a chance, go to Steam database.info or steamdb.info and look at the Heartspire Force CCU growth. It doesn't have big peaks or big valleys. It's very slow build-up over time. Retention is kind of the name of the game for us, if we believe that the game will have retention or not. And that goes into, of course, pillars. Do we want to play it? Does it have a staying factor? And etc. But also, everything is just a theory or a hypothesis before you actually launch the game, right? What we usually do is we agree with the developer. We always do 3 scenarios. Mm-hmm. Great, good, bad, based on how much we sell, even more importantly, our retention. So Mechabellum is kind of our latest kind of game that has a lot of potential, we think.
Yeah.
When we launched it, it had 5,000 CCU, so concurrent users, its first week, which is like, for an indie game, it's pretty good. By no means a runaway success, right? Like it's not, it's no Manor Lords, if you will.
Yeah, of course.
But it had 5,000. And then on day 30, 1 month later, it had gone down to, I think, 1,000. And then it never went down further. Just stayed there. That's a pretty good indicator. So what then happened was, okay, the studio keeps working on the game. We haven't stopped marketing the game. Obviously, we keep marketing it. But we kind of see this scenario and we go, okay, we're basically saying that, okay, we're hitting a scenario here where we have the retention we want on day 30 and then day 60. That makes us think that if we keep investing in this game more than what any normal publisher would do, over time, this is going to hit critical mass, we think. In March last year, I think it was, and this is very easy to just look at SteamDB as well. Look what happened with Mechabellum in beginning of April of this year. That's when we started to turn on the machine again. We kind of analyzed what the players wanted, what they didn't. We rebalanced the game. The studio has introduced a few new features to improve retention even further. And every time we have a marketing beat, since then, you can see like CCU curve going like that, and then just bump, small bumps. It just responds perfectly to every time we push it. It responds. That's how you know you have a winner, I think. We still haven't released the game. I mean, in 1.0, that's coming on September 26th. I think we're going to have two scenarios. We're going to have a breakout scenario, or we're going to have like, this is it's a good scenario. It's no breakout, but it's good. And we'll keep investing in the game. That's what you want. You want that kind of responsiveness whenever you do something happens, right? If nothing happens at all, I think another game that we have in our portfolio, which is on the other end of the spectrum in terms of size. So it's called Stardeus. It's made by a fantastic solo developer, Lithuanian guy, Tomas Vernekas. He's developed the entire game on Twitch.
Wow. He's
filmed himself every line of code and just has massive discipline. And he's making a colony sim called Stardeus. And it's a different scale, but we pushed out a big update a month ago, I think. A CCU went, immediate response, right? And it rests on a higher level than it was before. That's the important part. That it rests on a higher level than it started out with, right? Because that means that you can keep going. You can do this for a decade, right? There's no reason to believe that you can't be doing this for a decade. And those are the kind of games that we want. I don't know how big Stardeus is going to be, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be bigger in 3-4 years than it is today.
So when you're signing games, you're looking at sustained user base.
Yes.
And these are premium games. They're not free-to-play games.
They're not free-to-play games. They're premium games, most of them, yeah. I think I'm getting into your territory now a little bit, because we do have hard currency and soft currency store for Mechabellum, but it is also a premium game, so it's kind of a hybrid thing. We do have skins and stuff like that, so it's a bit of a hybrid. We do experiment with this model, but most of them are premium. Yes, they are.
Interesting. The question is like, how do you then differ from other publishers in this indie space? Like, you have these pillars, you're Swedish, you have good reputation, you focus on specific grand strategy genre, you want to see sustained player bases, but what sets you apart from the competition, from the coffee stain games, etc.?
So I think the thing that sets us apart, I'm going to allude to what we were talking about before. We have a 10-year perspective on our games, given that they hit a certain scenario. The people at Paradox Arc are the same people who put out many of Paradox Interactive's games in the past. So we have built franchises many times before over a very long period of time. We're not going to say no to a hit, obviously. Nobody says no to a hit. But we don't have to have a hit today, right? We have to have a sustainable business. That's what we need to have. So when we make decisions for games, given that they do show a promising sense of, sustained player base and then slowly growing player base, there's no end date. And we're willing to keep investing in something. It's not about us getting, a huge payday tomorrow. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to get something that will be really, really big over time. I want to find the next CK2. I don't expect to find the next CK3. And I think just on a personal, I think if your entire thing is based on only getting the hit, you're going to make other types of decisions, I think. I like to say that Paradox Interactive, we're not the biggest publisher on Steam by any means, but we are the biggest publisher on Steam with this audience. There is no other publisher that has the type of players that we're talking about. Players who typically
invest a shit ton more time into their games than the average player, buys way more games than the average player. We have a lot of those. That's not to say that we are an automatic, all of our games are successful, because they're not, right? That we're a really powerful modifier for the right game, right? If we have something that actually resonates with our audience, and we believe, of course, that the games that we sign, we believe will resonate with our audience, because we believe our audience wants games that are, in some way adhere to like Alice, the player experience that those come together as. I mean, it's very clear for me when I announced. So we signed a game called Idle Space. They have been out on Steam since 2019, I think, something like that. 4 or 5 years. It's a store page, you can't buy it. And we signed it, and we renamed it, and we repackaged it to fit more with what we think the experience is. And we put out one trailer on the Paradox Interactive YouTube channel, and it went from something like 10,000-15,000 wish lists to, I think today we hit 150,000. And that's because the promise resonates with the audience that we actually have. I don't want to sign a game where if I invest $100 in marketing, I get 101 back. I want games that if I put down 100, I get 150 back, just because of the audience that we have. And when we hit it right, that's what kind of happens.
Got it. So what they get is basically cross promotion.
Yeah, that's one of the main things. You also do get, everyone says that they're full of veterans, so it's not necessarily the thing that I put forward the fastest, but we have some of the most senior people at Paradox are working with ARC in terms of putting out new games to the market.
So you get expert service as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, how does this publishing work? Like, what else do I get? Like, let's say I'm an indie developer. I have a game. I have like 1,000 people always playing it. I don't have the resources to market it. I don't have any access to VCs, nor would they give me money. I don't really have anything to do other than to pray that people will suddenly find this and this becomes new hit. I sign with you. I assume I give you all kinds of rights and shares of the revenue and my youngest child and everything that goes with signing a deal for the publisher.
Everything.
Yeah, like that's, but what else? Like, what do I get back? And back, what I get is like I get cross promotion to a relevant audience that has provenly increased the pre-sign-ups, basically the wish listing of a game. But in my experience, what I've in the short time understood how the wish list works is it's kind of a crap. Like there's a small percentage.
It's definitely not predictive.
Yeah, exactly.
If you have 10, you're gonna sell 3. Like,
yes. So in that sense, I'm like, wish list. Okay, cool. I don't care because it's unpredictable and nothing comes. And then you say, well, we're also gonna, like, we have great people working at the company, which is 100% true, but many great companies with great people who have very little time because they're so great people and so in high demand that you may not get access to them at all or very little. And so that kind of doesn't come through. Like, what is the sort of a tangible, like, why am I making this deal as an indie developer with Paradox Arc?
That's a very good way to put it, I think. I mean, wish list, so same as with everything else on Steam, like, sales are the only thing that really, really matters, right? And like, if we're not able to sell enough, nobody's going to be happy. We can, followers on Steam and wishes are the only other kind of measurements you have. You also have, of course, like stored traffic, YouTube. It's the same thing. It's like, okay, 100,000 people watched your YouTube trailer, but did they care?
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to be able to guarantee that. So apart from the fact that you demonstrably, you reach very relevant audience, given that you think that your game is relevant to our audience, of course, there needs to be like a belief that that's true. So it comes down to the game and the match, right? If you have a game that matches with our audience, then I would say there's no other publisher that has the reach that we have to that audience. From a track record perspective, our first game that we signed was Across the Obelisk. They had been out in early access for a year and a half or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think they had sold something like 45,000 copies, something like that. We took it over, we signed it,
took over the management of the game, we realized that the X factor of the game was something else than what they were marketing themselves. Basically, it's a card battler kind of RPG adventure story sort of thing. People will think Slay the Spire, right? That's kind of how it was marketed. Like, oh, this is a really good card battler. So, okay. There's also Griftlands. There's a million card battlers these days, right? What actually makes this special? At that time, it was the only one that had clean co-op that actually really worked. So we repositioned it as the co-op deck builder. That's what we called it. If you look at the reviews today, that's how people talk about it too. It went to launch week, we had 14,000 CCU. To this date, I think we have sold 400 plus thousand copies. I mean, that's a really clear example of what happens when the game, the audience, and the publisher lines up. This is also a very clear before Paradox Arc and after Paradox Arc in terms of pure sales. Of course, that result is not necessarily something you can translate one-to-one to every game, because every game is, and that's kind of the hard part about our business, right? Regardless if you're in mobile or if you're in Steam or console, like, games are so complex. Like, they're not just, they're pieces of software, they're engineering feats, but they're also cultural things, right? They need to be relevant to people from they need to make you feel something, and at the same time you need to sell it in a way that conveys that, but also doesn't overpromise it. Like, there's so many factors that it's impossible to say you're going to get this exact result just by going with Paradox Arc. The answer is no, you're not going to get exactly the same result for all of our games, regardless if it's both when they have been on the market before we designed them, or games that only had a store page or whatnot. So very clear before and after for everyone, I think.
Step into the future of game monetization with Xsolla, the premier partner for game developers seeking to expand their reach and revenue. Xsolla provides a robust suite of tools designed to enhance user acquisition, manage subscriptions, and streamline payment solutions worldwide. Unlock new markets and maximize profitability through their customized, secure payment architecture and dedicated support team. Xsolla, powering game developers to achieve global success.
This podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer. In today's digital world, understanding your app's journey from discovery to download is more than just insightful, it's essential. Enter AppsFlyer, the leader in mobile attribution and marketing analytics that allows you to measure the full potential of your marketing efforts, making every ad dollar work smarter. With AppsFlyer, that's your new reality. Dive deep into data-driven insights that reveal exactly where your users come from and how they'll interact with your app. AppsFlyer, where your app's potential meets performance.
On mobile, the way the publishers work typically is that publishers take a percentage of the revenue, significant percentage, but at the same time, when you do sign a publishing deal, they often, at least the good ones, pay for the development fees. And then there's usually a certain type of an exit clause, whether that is an asset purchase or the acquisition of the entire studio. That is kind of like the goal for that third-party studio to be working with a publisher. Do these type of elements also come in with PC or publishing? Like, do you pay for the development? And of course, you take the revenue share, but is the end goal for the indie publisher to sell the game for you or sell themselves to you? Like, how does it work?
The short answer is yes. So basically, we have two types of projects, if you will. We have projects where we pay for everything, not only publishing, but also development. And we basically own the studio's burn rate, right? So if there's a delay, we pay for that delay, right? This is what we call the prototype track. So obviously these are way higher risk for us. In this case, we will own the game, we will own the IP, and we will also try to de-risk it as quickly as possible. So what we will do in this situation is we'll go to we will agree with the indie. We'll sign the prototype agreement where we say, okay, you get, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9 months to make a prototype, to kind of prove out X, Y, and Z that you want to prove out. The most important part here is not that it looks good. I really don't give a shit about graphics. This is 100% about systems, gameplay, core loop. This to be fun. I need to be able to not put it down, right? That's the most important part. But if it goes poorly, and by poorly it can be everything from, oh, it was kind of cool, it didn't really hit it though, or, the cooperation didn't work as we had hoped, or it wasn't cool. Like there's a million different reasons why it can't be cool. We will end it there. And we'll say, okay, we paid for everything. You can actually have the prototype back. And if you want to go and finish this project, even with someone else, you can do that. You own the rights now. The only thing we want back is the initial investment that we did in the form of royalties once the game releases, if it releases. When that sum, which, relative to the entire project is fairly modest, when that has been paid back, we're gone. Like there's no hooks or anything left where it's clean, we're gone. And the principle here is we never want to stand in the way of a team who wants to make a game. And if they're successful, then we'll say, okay, we're going to take this to early access, or we're going to take it straight to 1.0. There's a new agreement. This is more kind of akin to a classic kind of a work for hire agreement, I suppose. What makes us different here to some others is that we don't necessarily sign the contract based on a milestone schedule. That's a classic thing that people do in work for hire contracts. They go, milestone number 1, I need to deliver this and this and this feature. Milestone number 2, I need to deliver this and this and this feature. We don't do that. The reason why is because people start to try to deliver what's in the contract, not a great experience. Because you have this kind of relationship where, well, if I don't deliver exactly according to the contract, I'm not going to get paid. You lose track of what's important in a project. What's important is to deliver a sick player experience and that you show progress towards that. That's what's important, right? So we don't do milestone schedules. If the developer wants to use them, that's another thing, right? Be free to do that if you want. But we're not going to base it on that. What we do then is we basically pay every month. We expect to build a month where we can just follow the progress, basically. So that's sort of the prototype part where we pay for everything, but we own everything. Mm-hmm. The other part is the co-publishing agreements. So those are usually, the project will have come quite a way already. We definitely have something very playable. Sometimes the developer needs a bit of money. Sometimes they're just looking for a publishing partner. Here we usually work with a minimum guarantee and rev share. Then we have another thing that is important to us. Our goal, like we talked about before, is to build something over a very long period of time. We don't want to build something that we're not gonna be part of in 2 years, right? What we want to have is a buyout clause in the contract, not the studio. The goal for us is not to buy the studio, but it is to buy the IP. The intention with that is not to shut the studio away from the project, because honestly, if you have a project that someone created, it's very difficult to replace a studio and on any sort of game project, I think. The intention then is that the relationship will turn into more of the former, so more like a work for hire relationship on that particular game. But that we have the ability to, I want to be able to go to my board and say, I want to keep investing in this game for 6 years. And then we're going to go like, why? The publishing agreement runs out in 6 years. Yeah, that's true. Like, I want to be able to do that. It's not non-negotiable, but it is very important for us that we have a stake over a very long period of time. We work with MGs, which can, of course, help a developer to get to the finish line. But in that instance, it's a classic MG. It's a minimum guarantee. It's not, that mechanic is what that is, right? So,
What do you mean by MGs? So who pays an MG?
So we pay an MG. So minimum guarantee is basically, you give money to the studio. It depends on the type of agreement, because they are always like flexible, like when we get that back, who gets back which money first, and how that's going to be different. But basically it's money up front.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, because usually on mobile we pay MGs to the license holders,
right?
And that is the chunk sum that may or may not be reduced for the usage of the IP. So that's very clear. Is your approach different than other indie publishers in the market?
I would say that our motivations are different. It's a different model if you're hit driven, right? If you're driven by, I need a hit that sells 600,000 copies this year, next year, because then you're going to work in a different way, right? You're going to look much more for games that are already tracking. You're going to need to have quite different terms, very different risks, and you're not going to be able to do an MG that is higher than X, right? Because you need to protect your downside at every turn. I think that's a super viable thing to do, and I think there are many games that work for that, right? It's not a bad model in that sense, but it's not our model. Our model is the CK2 to CK3 model, where we find something that we invest over a very long period of time. So the decisions that we make along the way are going to be very different to someone who goes, great, we have a hit. Okay, go next, which is the next one. It also doesn't suit everyone, right? So in that sense, we're different. I think we're a very, very good alternative for the types of games that we want to sign, because the game pillars are there to guide which kind of game experiences we want to make, but also the types of games we want to make mechanically from also a business perspective, right? If they weren't there, we would sign all these games that were maybe much more short-lived. But if our games were much more short-lived, we would have a completely different perspective on when we sign a game, right? So that's where we are different. I mean, everything links into that. Like, we want to be there in 10 years. We want to have 100,000 concurrent users in 10 years. And we want to be there for that, right?
Mm-hmm. All right. So you've announced 9 games, and 6 of them have been released, to my knowledge. Titles like Across the Obelisk, Stardeus, Mechabellum, that is coming out soonish, September. We're recording this in September, so this month. Can you share insights on the development and the release process of these games?
They're all, of course, vastly different. So we talked a little bit about Mechabellum before, so maybe we don't need to cover that too much. But basically, the process for Mechabellum is very much the kind of process that I would like to see. We have a game that's promising. We have a marketing budget that I also want to add. I think our marketing budgets are slightly more significant than a typical indie publisher would have. We do everything that we can in order to take that successfully to the market. We do, it happens, we see retention, and that's when the work starts. Especially on Steam, we look at player feedback and we try to adjust our game according to player feedback and etc. But that is where that kind of starts. We saw the retention we wanted, we prepared for 1.0, and then once we hit a certain date, which is in this case March or April this year, I think it was April, I want to say April, we do a relaunch, we up everything, and then we have a very clear target for how many players we want before we go into 1.0. And then, of course, the hope and belief is that once we do that and find more players, the same relative amount of players will keep sticking around in the game after launch. And then we will keep building upon that, basically. I think the same thing has been true for Stardeus. It's in a much just smaller scale, smaller game. But we launched it, for an indie, again, like it had a great launch. It's not significant for Paradox, but we see retention. So when Thomas comes back to us and says, I've been working very hard on this big update, can we do something? The answer is yes, of course we can do something. We do kind of a small relaunch with a new update. We update the key art, the logo a little bit. We take some new screenshots. We do an influencer campaign on primarily YouTube and Twitch. Paid ads on Reddit and etc. And we see if, does it hit that number that we think it needs to hit? The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so everything like that provokes a new decision all the time. I think once you hit release or you hit the next milestone, that's always a result. It's not one decision you make. It's like 83 decisions, and hopefully more than half of them are good rather than bad, right? And that really is what the process looks like for us. What we don't do, and I want to say this because it's really important to us, we don't tell our developers how to make their game. And it's not because we don't have opinions. We definitely have them. But when it comes to creative opinions about games, we don't give them. We try to really hard to limit them to a minimum. And sometimes that can be frustrating for a developer. Sometimes the developer really wants input on a mechanic or a design decision. The problem that we have with that is that if one has the money and the other one is dependent on that money, whatever the one with the money says can be interpreted in different ways, right? And it's the same reason why we don't have milestone schedules. Because the second we start to provide that sort of input, like the risk that the game project turns into pleasing us instead of creating the player experience that they set out to create, that kills games, in my experience. We definitely provide feedback in the sense of players are churning here because the UI is the UI, and you need to look at the UI probably. We'll go, okay, how should I make my UI? We have experts, we have UI experts that we can connect you with, and you can work together with them, teams that can help you do certain things with your game, but you need to drive that decision. You need to drive the creative decisions. We only want to work with studios who really have crystal clear creative vision and who want to keep in control of that creative vision. And it doesn't matter if it's a co-publishing deal or if it's we pay for everything, we own everything. You need to drive every creative decision. And it can even come to a point where we're going to sign a game and the studio goes, what do you think we should do with this? That's a clear sign for us that maybe this is not the kind of relationship that we want to have. If you're not clearly in the driver's seat of your own creative vision and you're looking for like a co-pilot, we're not that co-pilot. So that's important for me to mention.
Understood.
I think.
And how do you ensure that games like, let's say, like Mechabellum that is going to launch or other ones, like how do you ensure it has what it needs for long-term success? Because you are talking about building essentially cohort on cohort, but coming in from free-to-play world, we release updates on at least weekly basis, sometimes even a shorter time. And you're talking about DLCs. How many DLCs are coming a year? 1, 2? Like, how do you build on top of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends, right? So Mechabellum, I would say, is more akin to what you are used to. Mm-hmm. It is more of a live service model, right? And the idea there is to have, I'm not going to say exactly the amount of weeks on the cycle, but it is close to what you mentioned. And there is definitely cycle upon cycle upon cycle, right? And the person on our side who is lead on that from Paradox Arc has released something like 40 live service games or something. So it's definitely something that we're familiar with in that sense. In terms of DLC, the interesting part of the DLC model, if you look at our grand strategy games, is that the big DLCs are the ones that drive player numbers. The thing that drives retention is our $20, $25 big expansions. You can see that very, very clearly if you look at our grand strategy games. And it's counterintuitive because you think a DLC will only target players who already own the base game, right? But the fact is that DLC, the big ones, are the ones that drive new player acquisition for Paradox. I think it's because our big DLCs are usually, obviously they all introduce new systems and new gameplay and all that. They usually center around new player fantasies as well, because most of our games are sort of, they're boxy games, right? I think that's what drives it for those kinds of games, and it works very differently for what I think is kind of the mobile or the live service model. The hard part about having our model and our types of games is, of course, that our games are very systems heavy and very, very complex. So making these big ones, it does take a lot of time. I think it's a rare occasion when we have managed to put out 2 per year. Usually we have 2 small ones that we call content packs or something like that, which are usually more cosmetics focused. And then we have a mid-size one, which is, when I worked in Stellaris, we call them story packs.
It sounds absurd compared to mobile gaming, where you're saying essentially like, we're going to release one update a year, which for mobile would be a death blow. Like, it's the same as having an inactive game. So definitely the pace is different, and stacking audiences is probably like a lot harder, because you're at the same time competing against so many new games that are launched on Steam. It's not like you're going to be playing the same game over and over again, because it's essentially the same game where nothing happens except once a year there will be a DLC. Like I play some PC games where I'm like, oh my God, I like Total War. There's new characters that I can play with. Yeah. And so I'm going to go back to a Total War and now play with Persia or Babylon or whatnot. And of course, when we're talking about paid games are also the type of games that you can restart. And part of the fun is restarting. It's almost the best thing is when you restart your XCOM, your Civilization, your Crusader Kings, whatever you name it. Like, the best thing is, now that you know what's going to come in mid-game or maybe even late game, let's start again and play it knowing what will happen in the future, and you feel much better. And they're made in a way they are exciting to restart and exciting to kind of start with maybe a new character or a new country or whatnot. So that really drives the retention eventually, is like how replayable these games are, because they're not persistent. And so that's why the business model. Now, I wanted to kind of zoom out and really talk about like what's going on with the industry, especially with indie games, because we've seen the rise of indie games. We've seen the challenges of AAA games, of these plus $100 million budgets, sometimes even more. The game comes out and just flops. And of course, at that point, Manor Lords is, of course, a great example of one person. They sold the concurrent users on Steam of that game compared to this other game made by a gigantic publisher that spent, years in development and now launched and is just abysmal compared to it. And so there's almost like a newfound interest towards indie games. There's newfound interest towards PC, especially with PC doing so well with the Chinese consumers being able to access Steam. How do you see these trends evolving, and how are you positioning ARC against these favorable PC trends?
Yeah, the trends are favorable, but I also think that Steam is full of games these days. I think last year 16,000 games came out. I think the average revenue of a game on Steam last year was something like $4,000, something like that. Of course, it's going to be like, 80% of those games are going to be like, banana. It's going to be like nothing, just because the platform is so accessible, right? So most people can put it out. But the competition is still murder. And I think this happens in PC as well, this exact trend. But I think at the end of the day, the trends, there are always going to be trends up and down. I think a mistake is to try to control them, because I think it's like anything that is so complex, it's impossible to control, and you have to kind of swim with it. My insight is that we have to keep focusing only on the player experience. That's the only thing that matters. My whole pitch for Paradox Arc, which was, started something like 3.5 years ago, something like that, was like, Valheim was made by 4 dudes, but Minecraft was made by 1. Manor Lords is, they have a team now, but like essentially the pre-product was made by 1 guy. A RimWorld made by 1 guy from the start, Tannen, Sylvester. And for that matter, PDS games, Paradox Development Studio games, they were not big from the start. They were very small teams. The big insight that I think especially people who have tried to get into the industry in terms of like VCs and etc., is that investment does not correlate with outcome at all, especially not in a industry that is so driven by if you have something culturally relevant or not. Like, if you have someone who says they know what's going to be the next big thing, I would call them out. Nobody knew that Little Company was going to be big.
Yeah.
Little Company had something like, 150,000 CCU or something on its launch week. And it's made by, as far as I understand it, a guy who has made exactly the same game a couple of times before that didn't make it big. They're like, okay, but you can't really program for that, right? So you have to program for things not being a hit, because most of them won't be, right? Mm. So in terms of trends, I think the reason why some indie games are successful is because they are able to take risks. They're able to think about risk in a completely different way than a company like Activision can. Because they're not making their games primarily to make money, I think. And that's kind of the key. They really want to make those games. And the only way you can make them is if you really want to make them. I talked to Thomas Wernicke, who's making Stardeus, which is an extremely complex game to make. Like, so systems heavy. It's basically real world in space, right? And he did all the systems. He did all the art. He did all the music. He did all the writing. Everything. All the game design by himself. You can't do that thinking like the risk is obviously huge for someone who at least when you start out, before you have a contact with Paradox Arc or someone else, like the risk is massive, right? But that is also the key to why they are successful, right? Because they don't compromise on anything, I think. But, that's why I think that what we do is so meaningful. And that is also why I think that we will continue to have the attitude that we have, is because we don't want to sign indies and turn them into something that they're not either, right? We want to sign them. You want to sign RimWorld because RimWorld. So I think indies are successful because they can take creative risks that others can't. That's the main reason why I think that they are successful. And then there's a million things that an indie will not be able to do well. Marketing their game is usually one of those things, because you don't want to have to think about the top 50 influencers I'm going to try to reach while I'm coding my system for a dog. Like, you don't want to mix those things together, right? They also probably need money because they need to eat and they need to be able to to make it right. There's a bunch of other things, and that's where I want to be to alleviate that and help them. Like, for me, it's like I want Paradox Arc to be the catalyst and to be the difference between being, a pet project to something that can be a sustainable big thing over time. I want to be that stepping stone for them. I don't want to be the person who thinks that I know how to make the game that they're making themselves and tell them how to do it. That's not who I want to be in that equation.
Probably not looking at that.
I think that's how. Then you remove the whole X factor.
Last thing before I'll let you go, like, what is your advice for indie developers to get in contact with Paradox Arc? Like, how do you get signed by Paradox?
So getting in contact with us is really easy. It's, go to our website and post your pitch. There's a page for that, and we read everything. We have 2 game business developers / game scouts who look at everything. I think in order to get signed, there are 2 things that are more important than anything else. Number 1, what is your game promise? Why should, like you asked me in the beginning of the podcast, like, why does the world need Paradox Arc?
Yeah.
Why does the world need this game, right? Say that you're making a game, I don't know, you're making a military sim, or you're making a team-based shooter game. Like, why should I play that and not Counter-Strike 2? Because I have Counter-Strike 2, I've invested a lot of money. Why should you want me to stop playing that and play that? Why? And the answer can't be a list of 25 features that are cool. So I like to tell people that think about your Steam page. So in the top right corner, you have a little capsule, and then below that, you have a short description of your game, and it's like 2 sentences, maybe 3. Write that, like really write that, right? Why is Hearts of Iron 4 cool? Hearts of Iron 4 is cool because you can depose Hitler and take charge of Germany and change the course of history. You can be France and become a syndicalist anarchy and fight against the UK in an alternate timeline. It's super easy to explain why it's cool, right? Mm-hmm. All of the ones that you've played and that you love, you can explain very quickly why you love them. And I think there are many games that have it, but they just aren't able to express it. You need to find your reason of being in the world and expressing that in a way that's compelling. Number 2, if you want to get signed by Paradox Arc, the more playable your game is at this stage, the lower the risk is going to be, because we're going to be able to judge it, basically. Like, help us judge the game, basically, by making it as playable as possible. That will increase your chances a lot, right? If you have something that's already kind of cool, that makes it very easy for us to argue. The more theoretic, the more on paper a product is, the more certain we have to be about your ability, right? You know how many cool paper products you and I have both seen through the years, right?
I don't trust any of them.
No. Like games are about executive ability. Can you make it? Can you not? Proof is in the pudding. And it's the same way as when we judge all our builds. It's like, yeah, we know what they want to do, but what have they done? That's the only thing that matters, right? And that's the only thing we can judge. So the more playable your thing is, the easier it's going to be to get signed, I think.
All right. Get crazy, get playable, and pitch. That's the way to separate yourself from the pack.
Yeah.
And get those pre-sign ups.
Yeah, exactly.
or on the want list. But no, in all honesty, this is a very interesting area of gaming, indie gaming, that has been overlooked for quite some time.
Yeah.
And it is driving a lot of innovation. It is driving a lot of the news. It's hit and miss like anything, but it's amazing when it hits and when it's developed by just one person or just few people, and it creates such a wave. And so it's understandable why publishers are looking at that segment, specifically these indies, because they in many ways also evolve how we view games. Like, they bring in the start of new genres. Sometimes they can't quite make it into a new genre, but others pick it up. But they have that innovation because it's kind of, the costs are so small.
It's what made Paradox from the start. Like, people didn't want to sign our games. Like, this is for real. Like, they didn't want to sign Paradox Development Studio games because they didn't understand if it was an RTS or if it was turn-based. And the truth is, it wasn't either, right? It was a grand strategy game. So, they carved out their own part of the pie and created something completely new. That's what makes it cool, right?
Well, Sebastian, thank you for your time. Thank you for the cool stories.
Yeah,
and
you so much for having me. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you. You're welcome to come back anytime when you have more traction on the Paradox Arc and talking about the other success cases, whether that's Mechabellum or something that is totally unexpected that blows up after DLC number 5 into something totally unique.
When I have them.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And you'll find Sebastian on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to reach out.
Yeah.
So, thank you, everybody.
You did it. You made it to the end of the episode. As a fan of the show, it would help us out if you subscribe and leave us a review on the podcast service of your choice. More importantly, are you a member of the Deconstructor of Fun Slack group? If you have 5 years or more of games industry experience, go to deconstructoroffun.com/Slack and apply to join. Join the games industry's best professional community filled with peers always willing to lend a hand. Or subscribe to our newsletter to get all the latest insights from the Deconstructor of Fun content creators. Thanks for listening.